Hey guys, it's another Biology with Miss Cherry. We're here today. We're starting to look a little bit more in detail at the cardiovascular system. So moving away from gas exchange, we're not looking at respiration so much. Instead, we're looking at the flow of blood and how it moves around the body. So start by having a look at these pictures. They shouldn't be too difficult. What do the pictures show and why are they important? Hopefully we'll cover all of these answers in the next few slides for you. Pause and play again when you're ready. So today's lesson is specifically focusing on the heart, so heart anatomy or cardiac anatomy. We're going to be looking at the structure of the heart both externally and internally. There's a few tasks that I'm going to ask you to do. It's not a very big one. There's only about 20 slides, so hopefully this shouldn't take too long, but spend all the time you need to make sure that you are confident with labelling diagrams of the heart and recognising the anatomical features that make it function so perfectly. Now, before we move on, and before we even get into looking at any A-level science about the heart, what do you know? So on OneNote, you should see that there's a diagram that looks very similar to this, which is also unlabelled. Spend a bit of time doing some research and finding out what each of those labels are. I'm going to pause for a second, and then I'm going to start going through the answers, so you can pause the video now and do that research yourself for me. So pause here. Alright, so we're going to start in the top left corner and we're going to work our way around clockwise. So the top left corner is the vena cava, the source of blood flow from the body back into the heart. So this blood that's coming in through the vena cava is deoxygenated. And in fact, because this vena cava is at the top of the heart, and we'll explain the vena cava at the bottom in a second, we call this one the superior vena cava. It's above the heart structure. Moving on clockwise, we have got the aortic arch, or you might have just put the aorta. Both of those absolutely fine. The aortic arch just implies that we're looking specifically at the loop over the top of the heart. Carrying on round, we have got the pulmonary arteries. Okay, and pulmonary is to do with the link between the heart and the lungs. So the pulmonary arteries go away from the heart structure to the lungs. And carrying on round, we've got the pulmonary veins, which carry the oxygenated blood back into the heart. So it's gone from the lungs back to the heart. Further down though, carrying on down the right hand side, this vessel that we're looking at covering the heart's surface itself is one that you might not have seen before. And it's actually the left coronary artery. Okay, so the left coronary artery is key in supplying the heart muscle, the cardiac muscle, with blood. Because remember, it's still a muscle, it's still going to need oxygen to supply it. Further down, we have got the left ventricle. And then we've got another vessel that you might not have heard of before, but do need to recognise, and that is the blue one, very similar to the coronary artery, except it's the coronary vein. Alright, bottom of the heart structure now, so close to the apex, we are looking at the descending aorta. And we call it the descending aorta because it literally descends down the body, the abdomen. So it runs over the aortic arch, so the aortic arch up here. And if you imagine behind the heart, it sort of carries on down like that. And that will just provide all of the oxygenated blood to your lower body. So the lower extremities, your abdominal organs, things like that. Moving towards the left-hand side of the diagram now, we've got another vena cava, but this time it's slightly lower. Okay, so we've got the superior vena cava up at the top where I've put the little star, but this one is the inferior vena cava. So it still goes into the same site, it still goes into the right atrium, but it's just come from the lower extremities rather than the brain and the neck and things like that. Much like on the left-hand side, we have got the right ventricle, and then we have got the right coronary artery. I'm just going to put R. And then finally, we have got the right atrium. So if you didn't get any of those correct, or maybe you missed a few of them out, spend some time now, pause this, double check your knowledge of the anatomy, and then we're going to move on to the next diagram, which is the internal structures. And so here again, I've got a lovely diagram. It's on OneNote for you to label yourselves. So pause again, do some research, see if you can find the picture, and label it up for me, and then play again when you're ready to go through it with me. So we're going to start going through this with the structures that we know about already. So we're going to start right at the very top in the middle with the aorta. Okay, remember, this would go to the aortic arch, which should sort of look like that behind the rest of the structures. And the next label clockwise shows the pulmonary arteries. Hopefully this diagram is somewhat familiar to you. GCSE, I know the anatomy for the heart isn't very detailed, but it should include most of these things. Following on from that in a clockwise direction, we've got the first chamber of the heart, and we haven't discussed these yet, but the first chamber on the left-hand side is the left atrium. And if we skip down a few labels, we've got the second chamber of the heart, which is the left ventricle. And the way I like to remember it is if you've got the heart and it's split into 4, you can imagine that an A is going to fit nicely there and a V fits nicely in the bottom. So the atria are at the top and the ventricles are at the bottom. And remember, in the heart, left is right and right is left. So this picture, you've almost got to imagine, if you put your hand on it now, your right hand, if that was sitting in your chest, it would be rotated 180 degrees. So where your thumb is, if you put your thumb now so your palm faces your chest, you can see that the left hand side where your thumb is now the right hand side of your body. Okay, so that's why the left is the right and the right is the left. We'll carry on labelling those chambers before we get onto the extra bits. So we've got the right ventricle over here. I'm just going to write right vent and then right atrium at the top. And then we've got all of the bits that we haven't really discussed or might not have heard of necessarily before. So where an atrium and a ventricle split or are separated, there's things called valves. You know, those flaps of skin that stop backflow. You've heard about them in the veins before. When we're looking between an atrium and a ventricle, we call them atrioventricular valves. And that's an annoying word that you do have to be able to spell. But in some cases, if you've written it once, you can just abbreviate it to AV valve. Okay, this is the left atrioventricular valve, and then you've got the right AV valve over on the right hand side. And again, we have got another pair of valves that separate a ventricle. So if I shade it in for you, just here, with the vessel that leaves the heart. So from the right hand side, we're talking about going to the pulmonary artery. From the left hand side, we're talking about going through the aorta. And those valves are not called atrioventricular valves, obviously. They're not between an atrium and a ventricle. Instead, they are called semilunar valves because they look like half moons. Okay, and semilunar valve over there as well. Finally, we've got this bottom right label, which is a word that some of you might have pierced, some of you might know it's the same as the gap between your two nostrils, and it's called the septum. Sometimes they like you to call it the ventricular septum because it separates the ventricles visibly. All right, so hopefully you got most of those. If not, spend some time recapping, reflecting, and let's get into the new stuff then. So the first couple of key words to know is that the heart is myogenic. Okay? It's made of cardiac muscle, and that myogenic or myogenicity means that it can beat by itself. It doesn't need you to think about it. And also that means that it can pump outside of the body by itself without any innovation from you. It is a continuous beating. It operates throughout your entire life, but it is key to survival, and therefore it's protected by lots of physiological mechanisms. We've got the sternum, that breastplate. If you feel between your chest, there's a hard bit, so where your collarbones are, if you keep following, or where your collarbones meet, sorry, keep following down your chest, and sort of in between where I guess your cleavage would be, that's your sternum. It's really, really hard. You can try knocking it if you want. I wouldn't recommend it. But you've also got the ribs as well. And the ribs combined with the sternum effectively act like a cage around our heart to keep it safe and hold it in place. And the heart is actually, when you think about it, two separate systems, because we know that we're looking at a double circulatory system. We did that in the last lesson. So the blood has to flow through the heart twice to get from a deoxygenated state to an oxygenated state and then out to the body. And those two separate pumps are as follows. So we're going to start, I'm going to label all of the first pump in blue. So I'll highlight that for you. And we are starting coming in from the body through the vena cava, so the inferior and the superior vena cava, into the right atrium. The blood then flows through the right ventricle, up through the semilunar valve on the right hand side, and out the pulmonary artery to the lungs. At the same time, we've got blood coming in from the lungs, in through the pulmonary veins, to the left atrium. This is our second pump. So now we're in the left atrium. We're going to drop our blood down to the left ventricle, and then we're going out again through the semilunar valves, but out from the aorta and to the body. Two separate systems that occur concurrently. So they're occurring at the same time. And let me just label in there, sorry. Pump 2 is the green. Okay, so pump 1, the movement from the body to the lungs, that is for your deoxygenated blood. And then pump 2 is when we're starting to move our oxygenated blood. Now remember that these two separate pumps carry those two different types of blood, and if those two types of blood start to mix, so the oxygenated and the deoxygenated blood, if they start to mix, you get illnesses. Your blood isn't oxygenated enough. You can become tired, fatigued, maybe not grow as efficiently. And generally, if you've got a hole in the heart condition, say as a baby, we say that they have failure to thrive. So that means that they maybe don't develop as quickly as a normal healthy baby might. And that highlights the key importance of the septum, that bit of tissue, that slightly flexible bit of cardiac muscle that separates those two ventricles. Now have a go at this question. Use the diagram to explain why it's important that blood goes through the heart again after leaving the lungs, where the pulmonary capillaries are. Pause and play again when you're ready. So this diagram here shows the pressure of the blood on the y-axis at various stages of the circulatory system. And I was key to highlight the fact that we're talking about the pulmonary capillaries onwards before we start moving back into the heart. And you can see here at these capillaries, so where the blood has exited the lungs, the blood is at a really, really low pressure. In fact, the lowest pressure almost throughout the entire circulation. Now, what happens between the pulmonary veins and the aorta again is that we go through the heart muscle. Okay, and going through that heart, you can see rapidly ramps up the blood pressure. Okay, we need the low pressure through the lungs because we don't want our lungs to burst and to fill with blood. That would be a really bad time. But if we had this low pressure from the pulmonary veins and stuff throughout the systemic circulation, so around the body, that's going to mean that circulation is like trying to wade through custard. It's going to be so slow, so much hassle. So instead, putting our blood back into the heart gives it that extra little oomph, that extra little push to get around the body at a nice high pressure. And yeah, once you get into the systemic circulation, the pressure starts to drop off, but that's actually quite useful for things like diffusion. But now take a look at this picture. So we've said that the blood goes from the lungs using the pulmonary veins back into the heart. So we're moving towards the left-hand side of the heart now, back from the lungs. Look at that structure of the heart. How does that heart structure increase the pressure of the blood before it goes around the body? Take a look. And if you're not sure what we're looking at here, we've got this diagram on the left-hand side to show you. We're effectively taking a heart and we're cutting straight through the middle of it sideways on, and we're looking sort of top down. A bit like if you were to look into a yogurt pot and see the yogurt rather than the side of it. So pause and play again. Have a think. How does that structure of the heart suit forcing blood around the body at a really high pressure? And it's all to do with the wall of the left ventricle. So you can see here, the ventricular wall on the left-hand side is thick. It is huge. So if we look at it actually on a cross-sectional image, the right ventricle side is really thin. But this left ventricle side means that the blood's only got a really tiny space to fill in, to sit in. But the same amount of blood that leaves the right side comes back into the left. So that means that in that left-hand side, the blood is really, really, really tightly compacted. And that in turn is going to increase the pressure. And when it forces out of the aorta, it's really, really high-powered, high-pressured, high speed. Okay, and that's going to mean that we get that really quick blood flow around the heart. Now, we're only going to have a quick look at valves this lesson, because the next lesson where we look at the cardiac cycle is going to be a little bit more in depth about this. So in the heart, we have got the atria above the ventricles. Remember, we've done that little diagram where we can fit an A at the top and V's at the bottom. Or you can remember that atria and above both have A's, and the ventricles are below the valves, both have V's. Now, on the right-hand side of the heart, we have got the atrioventricular valve, the right one, and also a tricuspid valve. This is another way of calling the semilunar valve. You can use semilunar. Tricuspid is slightly more scientific. Okay, and on the left-hand side, we've got that AV valve again, so the atrioventricular valve, but the semilunar valve is actually called the bicuspid valve. And the way that I remember it, if you can't remember tricuspid and bicuspid, which way they should be used, the word left has got fewer letters in it than right, and bicuspid has fewer letters in it than tricuspid. So the longer two words, right and tricuspid valve, go together, and the shorter words, left and bicuspid valve, also go together. Now, this is going to be important next lesson, not so much now. So don't dwell on it if you're struggling and you can't remember it right now. It's absolutely fine. And we'll cover it again next lesson if you're still confused. But hopefully we are not confused. And hopefully this table should be nice and easy. So spend a couple of minutes. You can draw it out or just copy and paste it if you can't be bothered. Drawing out this table, telling me where each vessel comes from and where it goes to. So it could be as simple as it goes from the heart to the body, it goes from the lungs to the heart, that's fine. Or you can be specific and say that it goes from the left ventricle, say, to the systemic circulation. Up to you. I've got the quite simple answers, but if you wanted to add that extra detail based on what we've done today, go for it. And also whether it's oxygenated or deoxygenated blood. So pause now and play again when you're ready. Okie dokes. So this is where we're looking at. So the aorta comes from the left ventricle to the body. Remember, that's our systemic circulation, and it is oxygenated, whereas the vena cava comes from the body, that systemic circulation, into the right atrium. You could have mentioned that there's the inferior from below the heart structure and the superior from above, so the brain, the neck, the arms, things like that. And the vena cava carries deoxygenated blood exclusively. Likewise, the pulmonary artery is going from the right ventricle to the lungs. You might want to talk about the alveoli there if you fancied it. And that's deoxygenated still. And then the pulmonary vein is going from the lungs to the left atrium, and it's now oxygenated, which is nice because we need that oxygen. Now, before we finish up, so we've only got a couple of slides left, you need to know about the heart's blood supply. Okay, so the heart actually has a couple of arteries that deviate or break off from the aorta. And you can see that here. So we've got the left ventricle pumping blood in the upwards direction out of the aorta. Remember, we've got that bicuspid valve, because the left-hand side has got bicuspid, which is preventing blood flow. So I'll just label that in there. Bicuspid valve. And then literally just after that valve, these two branches come out of the aorta. And those are your coronary arteries. Okay, so when you did GCSE science, you learnt about coronary heart disease. This is what we're talking about. So these vessels can start to get blocked. And this is what I would like you to do a little bit of research on. So what condition can occur if the coronary artery becomes blocked and why? And what happens, or what condition is called, if the coronary artery is just occluded? So that means narrowed slightly. This is extra research outside of the specification, so I haven't got the answers for this, but if you wanted to discuss what you've got in the chat, maybe you want to talk to me over Teams, then that's absolutely fine. Just give me a shout and we can discuss it. Okay, think about old people. Old people have these conditions quite a lot. So pause, spend about 5 minutes having a look at these and play again when you are ready. Now this says homework. We're at home all the time, as I say, each lesson. So this is something for you to do now. Have a go at completing all of the tasks on page 172 to 173, which is risk factors for cardiovascular disease. Can you please self-assess yourself using the mark scheme in the back of the book? So you might just have to have a little flick through and find out where that is. And let me know how you've done. Score yourself on your work for me so I can have a look. Now we're going to finish up with some exam questions. Thankfully, because this lesson wasn't too detailed, the exam questions are actually quite easy. So 2 marks here. Which blood vessel, which letter, carries oxygenated blood away from the heart, and which blood vessel carries the oxygenated blood to the heart? Pause, spend about a minute or two on this, and then play again when you're ready. Explain how the highest blood pressure is produced in the left ventricle. And then some babies are born with a hole between their left and right ventricles. These babies are unable to get enough oxygen to their tissues. Suggest why. Okay, use your knowledge. Give reasons for. And pause. Pause for about 4 minutes for this one and play again when you're ready. And the last question. During a myocardial infarction, areas of the heart muscle begin to die. Explain why. Now, I want you to pause for a second before you start. If you don't know what a myocardial infarction is, go and have a look at what it means now and add that to your notes. Hopefully you will have researched it in the supplying blood to the heart slide, where we looked at the coronary arteries, but you might not have done. So stop now if you haven't got any clue what this word means, or this little term means, and play again, or complete the question and then play again when you're ready and feel confident in that you know what it is. Answers wise then, you should have had C and then A. So C, if we go back to the diagram, was looking at the aorta, and A was returning blood to the heart from the body, and that was your vena cava. Notice there was no inferior or superior vena cava on that diagram. It was just a single vessel. And it also says ignore the name of the vessel. So if you didn't write the letters, and I did draw attention to it in the question, even if you got the vessel right, you wrong. For the second question, it was asking about why the left ventricle gives much higher pressure. You could have said because it's strong or strongest or stronger contractions. You could have also said that it's the most muscle in the wall, or that it's got the thickest or thicker muscle wall, but it has to be comparative. Okay, so you can't say it's got strong contractions. It's got stronger contractions. It was asking about the highest pressure, not just high pressure. 2C was asking about the oxygenated blood in babies, or why they might not get enough oxygen to the system. And this is because blood flows from the left ventricle mix with the right ventricle blood. And this is a mixing of oxygenated or deoxygenated blood. So both of those points, or either of those points actually, the mixing of the bloods or blood flow from left to right, is 1 mark. It's a standalone mark. So if you've said that blood flows from left to right and there's a mixing of oxygenated and deoxygenated blood, still only 1 point. And that means that a lower volume of oxygenated blood leaves the left ventricle. You could have also said that there's less oxygen in the blood leaving the left ventricle or leaving the aorta, something like that. The final question, though, was about the myocardial infarction. And the myocardial infarction is the scientific name for a heart attack. So what you needed to say was that this is because of a reduced blood flow in the coronary artery, or that the coronary artery is blocked. Coronary artery is underlined. It has to be in your answer for that mark. This means that we get less, not enough, or no oxygen to that heart tissue in any kind of context. And therefore, respiration drops or stops, so cells start to die. Notice for points 2 and 3, if you'd said less oxygen for respiration, that gets you 2 marks straight away. All right, so that's the end of this lesson. I hope you found it useful. Let me know if you need any support or help with anything, and I'll see you again next time. Bye.